So we have our panelists. I'd just like to reintroduce them in case anybody's joining us or coming from another session. And going from my left at the very end is Dr. Stanley Bird, and sitting next to him is Paul Scheib, and sitting next to Paul is Milo O'Born. And thank you again to our panelists for your great session and for leading us in dialogue today. So in closing, we have 15 minutes to be able to get some of your final thoughts on the day as we think about intersectionality and we think about the power shifts and power dynamics as we layer these categories of identity. And we also have the prompt, reflections on today and hopes for tomorrow. So I think what I'd like to do is go down the aisle, and if you could just give us your closing thoughts, reflections on today, and some of your hopes for tomorrow, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. So Milo, could you start?
Sure. I should have prepared more for that.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a lot, right? Reflections on today, hopes for tomorrow. It's like everything. It's the universe. But just a couple of thoughts that are in your head as we close today's discussion.
Yeah, so I'm still actually thinking about something that Dr. Bird did right near the beginning of his presentation, which was asking us, about our identities. And two things in particular. One was the way that validating identities just shifted the energy in the room, shifted the tone in the room in a really important way. And I think when we talk about intersectionality, and this was actually something, so Evelyn and myself and Tamara Lee from the Out Alliance promoted this, these dialogues on NPR earlier in the week. And one of the things that Evan Dawson said was, well, when people hear intersectionality, they kind of shut down and they're like, well, I don't have all of these marginalized identities and I feel bad and I feel guilty and so I kind of can't engage, or I feel oppressed by this idea. And I thought that the exercise of just clapping for other people's identities kind of shifted us out of that potentially emotional framework that was going to shut us down. And so I guess that's a reflection and also a hope for tomorrow, is that as we continue to do this work, we continue to validate each other's experiences and identities in that way, really active way, sometimes a way that seems silly, but when you clap for each other, when we clap for each other, it feels good. So even if it feels like it's a silly thing, doing those kinds of activities I think is really important. And then the other thing that stuck out to me about doing that exercise was how few people raised their hands when Dr. Bird asked how many people identify as Black, African American, Caribbean. And a hope moving forward is that we can build a more coalitional and less white group for attending these dialogues in the future. I would really hope that, since we're talking about intersectionality today, that one of the things maybe we can take out of it is thinking about who wasn't in the room when Dr. Bird asked those questions, and not just sort of bringing them in, but saying why? What are we doing that is creating that state of being, and then how can we change it so that we do get more diverse racial representation, but not because we've gone out and said, please come into this room, but because we've changed the things we're doing in order to actually be more attractive and supportive and useful to people of color.
Thanks, Milo.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think most of my reflections on today are that it's from my perspective as a activist, that while I am a gay white male, through my activism, I developed relationships with people outside of that. And so that I was able to increase my intersectionality, in that we were able to bring in people of color. We were able to bring in people of the deaf community in Rochester, specifically here, the deaf community here in Rochester, the women's movement in Rochester. So we were able to embrace, they were able to embrace us, and so that our issues became their issues and vice versa. so that, and my hope for tomorrow is that it continues moving forward. One of the questions that was brought up at the end of my dialogue or my breakout session was, well, what do we want to give to the young people and moving forward? And it's like, for me, it's, the fight isn't over. You can always look around. I mean, when you look at what's going on with like the Religious Freedom Acts and all of that, then there's always always going to be the next something up, coming up that you're going to need to look out for. And hopefully you'll have a wider sense of yourself to look for those things.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Paul, can you just hold that? I'll just hold that for a second. I really have to do one thing in the name of inclusivity before I give my comments. Any people in the room 80 or above, please stand. I was reminded about the fact that there are other generations that are also part of our group today, and so I really wanted to make sure that I honored Eric in having him be applauded. Milo, words out of my mouth, from my head, around the lack of black and brown and other people. I don't know what we can do different to be a part of this discussion, especially understanding how the oppression sits with those layers and layers and layers. So I don't know if people were frightened or didn't know, whatever, but certainly that's the same place I kind of landed with the reflection. I was deeply, deeply honored to the point of tears when Evelyn asked me to do this, because as I said to you, I never saw myself as an activist. I saw myself as a leader that was just moving into spaces that made sense. So Evelyn, thank you again, and the team for inviting me to be the keynote. It was really a pleasure. Thank you. This hope for tomorrow is really kind of challenging for me. One of the things when I was talking with Tamar, because I had an interview with her a few weeks ago, one of the things that I think is, it's so weird to say, missing, there was such an urgency 30 years ago. People dying around me, going to funerals and other celebrations of life almost every week. That urgency for our young people doesn't seem to be there anymore. And so some of the importance of certainly the work that we do around HIV and AIDS and other issues, it's not landing in that same way. And I'm not asking for anything bad to happen, but there's something that's something that's still lacking around the urgency of us making sure that we are meeting with those individuals, getting them into care, talking with them, et cetera, et cetera. So for tomorrow, my hopes, I've got an invitation already to spend some time with folks who are working with MOCA right now. So they've invited me back in, and so my hopes is to look at that a little bit closer. And my hope would be, let's figure out how to get young people to next year's dialogues. I just think that that's so important.
Thank you so much. So I have the mic that I can float around if you have questions for our experts. We have a few minutes left. Anyone? Be brave. Yes.
Actually, I was looking on Instagram when you're talking about size. What is it? No, you're talking about, all right. We're talking about Miley Cyrus. We have Sam Smith, a white privileged, he considers himself gay. And he's been pushing and pushing and pushing for rights. And on Instagram, he has a very large red dress on it, written on it says equality. So again, he's using his, his platform with who he is to push the boundaries too and help people. That's all I'm going to say.
Or comments, yeah. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question. You could have a comment about what you're thinking about as we close today.
As youngish person who's interested in activism. I was wondering if Dr. Bird could talk a little bit more about, do you have any sense of what made it so that young, in your day, young, other than, I mean, I know some of the things. Do you have any suggestions of what we as young people might replicate today to pull more people in, to build that sort of thing for ourselves?
That I needed this. To be honest, right now in this moment, I don't. And I think that's why I'm excited about being asked to work with MOCA again. Certainly when MOCA started, and I think certainly in its current state, there's a lot of young people who are still going to MOCA. I think I'd like to ask Paul if you can. Do you have any response to that because of the work that you do? Yeah.
I mean, for me, it was something that I was passionate about. And so you have to find your passion. I mean, I grew up in the same era as Stanley. I mean, my friends were dying. So for me, the fight against AIDS became my #1 priority in my life. My job, the career I chose was to make sure that I could care for people who have HIV and AIDS, and in the greater extent, the LGBTQ community. So, I mean, it's always been something that I've been passionate about. So I think find your passion, whether it be within the LGBTQ or whether it be for like Greta Thunberg in climate change. I mean, there's plenty of things out there. And I think for myself, I mean, as I was explaining in my talk, when I went to, we take it for granted here in the United States, as much as we take it for granted here in the United States, I think in Rochester compared to other countries. In most Muslim countries, for me to be an openly gay man, I would be put to death. We don't have to worry about that. And so I think, those are issues that we need to educate ourselves more about, so this way you can find things that you might be willing to fight for.
I want to say something about that too, because I think when we talk about activism in the LGBTQ community and we talk about the fact that the AIDS crisis as we think of it, even though AIDS itself is obviously not over, but the way that it became this motivation for change may have passed. It seems like we're implicitly talking about sexual identities, largely. We're not talking about gender as much, even though we have the T in LGBT. And that's not to say that trans people also didn't lose, friends and family to AIDS as well. But again, I want to mention this activist group that I'm a part of right now. Moore is here and is one of the co-chairs of Legion, and this is something Tuesday was in here too, is also a part of Legion, but may not be in here anymore. And so we have a couple members here. And that group is made up entirely of transgender people, and largely people who have lost their jobs, who have jobs that are very precarious, who aren't making ends meet. Like, there is an urgency there. So I am super, super, super privileged and lucky to not be in that position, but most trans people have a hard time finding work, get fired when they come out at work. Like, there is an urgency to that. So I think when we talk about, like, we've passed this stage of urgency, we're not necessarily thinking about all of the identities that are included. And, as I mentioned, if you're a trans person with a disability, if you're a trans person of color, if you're a trans woman, like, those, that precariousness just increases. So there are places where people are organizing around an immediate need. That need is just maybe different than it was, in the 80s.
Hello, and I'm really privileged and glad to be invited to this talk. And since Milo just brought up people with disabilities, I wanted to talk about the disability disability support that wasn't offered potentially at this, that could have been a talking point, because it's a talk about intersectionality. And disability wasn't mentioned very much. And there was a place on the registration to say if there were any accommodations needed. And then I said that I was visually impaired and that if there was a digital version of the program, I'd appreciate it. And so when I came, there was uncomfortable laughter. And when I asked about it, which then makes me feel that maybe nobody read those comments. that I put on there, and that maybe as a disabled person, I wasn't welcome. And I wanted people to think about that a little bit more. And I became disabled because of a hate crime because I was a queer person. So then to be shunned at a queer event and with uncomfortable laughter, it just makes one feel that you are continually not welcomed. And I know that I am welcomed here, and it was only because people are more uncomfortable by people with visual disabilities than people with HIV and AIDS, even though HIV and AIDS can lead to visual disabilities. So it was a dialogue that included AIDS, and one of the complications is vision loss. And I've noticed we came from the West Coast, and there were people there who were visually impaired due to HIV complications, and the blind community wasn't welcoming to them either. So then you're left in a place where you're queer, you're not welcome because you're blind, and then you're queer and you're not welcome because you have no community at all and you can't see who's around you, and so you're depending upon other people to support you, and then you're stuck in a very uncomfortable place where you don't know who to trust. I am lucky I wasn't affected by AIDS. In that way, I don't have HIV, and it was a hate crime. So I can tell people, and people then are uncomfortable about that, but it's not the same level of uncomfort. So I challenge people to think about visual disability, because how do you make, if you're trying to make the world a better place for people who have a disease that wasn't their fault, by telling them that they're not welcome, even subversively, is a challenge. But thank you for having the dialogue.
That is
I
such
just-
useful feedback. I just have to
Yeah.
say thank you so much for saying that. Like, really useful.
Just one interject a comment, just on behalf of the Rainbow Dialogues Committee. I just want to apologize for anything that you experienced today, and it's a really good lesson that there's always work to do. Even those that know have work to do, so it means that we still have quite a bit of work to do. Oh, there were two other questions, actually.
I'm white and straight and have learned a lot. I'm just overwhelmed by the information. It'll take me a long time to sort. But I do remember being at a conference about newspapers, and that the tipping point for AIDS was when people realized they knew and loved people who had it. And so I encourage people here to vote, to vote, to vote, to get your allies to vote, and try and move what we've got going forward. We're lucky in New York State in a lot of ways, and in many ways in the country as compared to other places. But please vote. We need everyone to vote, and young people will make the difference this year.
Hope so.
Hi. So my question is a little bit long, so just like first thoughts. But you guys were talking a lot about inclusiveness, about cis normality and stuff, as well as marginalized communities, HIV/AIDS and stuff. And my question is, what are your thoughts about how, as well as being cisgender, white privilege, stuff like that, influences everything in life? What are your thoughts about monogamy, monogamous relationships, polyamory? Because that kind of plays into everything that was discussed today as well, and it was not spoken about at all. So what are your first thoughts on those type of relationships?
I don't judge. I mean, I don't. Based on that, I mean, I am in a monogamous relationship and have been so for 32 years, but I don't presume that everyone else is going to be that. I know there's a lot of fluidity out there, so it's whatever you and your partners decide. If that's best for you, have at it.
What are your thoughts on like community and the different things you've been involved in? Just say that again. Your thoughts of like all of the things you all have participated in and stuff like that. How has that kind of underlying normative standard, unspoken about, influenced that? Like, think about it now and be like, how did this affect me then or now that maybe you didn't think about before?
Well, it's a great question, but it's really making me think a lot. When I think about even into my 30s, because of how I was socialized and my experience as being a gay person at that time, I did not think gay people got married. I had no clue that that was something that was even available to us, or even having long-term relationships. Up until my 30s, I didn't even realize that that was a real thing. And so I don't think I had my first real relationship until I was in my 40s, and I'm 66 now. So the part about other people's decisions about what the relationships look like, I know people who are in relationships that there's 3 people. I know people who feel that for some reason, they just don't want to be in one relationship, a monogamous relationship. And I'm talking about gay and non-gay people. And so, I mean, I just support them and love them. That's not my relationship. That's not a place for me to say anything about how they're living their lives. I really would like to think about that some more and maybe write an essay on it, because it really is, it's making me think, but I can't pull all the words together right now.
So in the breakout session that I did, I had the kind of normative man and normative woman chart up, and sometimes when I do a safe zone training and I use that, I also include sexual and affectional behaviors, and so there is another line that I put in that has to do with marriage, monogamous relationships, and then other ways of having sexual and affectional responses to other people or ways of behaving in the world. And I think 2 things, and this is in no way like a radical thing to say, but I think it's important to say. And one is that one of the ways that many LGBT people gain access to some privilege is through normative relationships and normative families. And that leaves out a whole bunch of people who don't have access to that or don't choose to do that. People are stigmatized if they're polyamorous. They're stigmatized if they're single, right? They're stigmatized. Asexuality is still highly stigmatized. We didn't talk about that much today, but it still is. And a lot of those things are stigmatized because they fall out of those normative relationships that, again, if you were in my session, underlie those ideas about normative men and normative women and how they relate to one another. Like the institution of marriage and normative family relationships really, again, has been incredibly deeply a part of the way that racism works in this country, the way that classism works in this country, the way that ableism works, the way that cisnormativity and homophobia work. So my initial answer is we could have said a lot more about it today and didn't, and it does fit into a lot of the power structures that I was talking about, so I appreciate you bringing it up.
Just thinking about the history of ACT UP, though, one of the important things that they did was articulate the right and the need to have sex in the middle of an epidemic, and to talk about the ways people could be sex positive, how people could have safe sex, and how AIDS didn't mean that people should stop having sex. So I think that is, an important piece. And in fact, a lot of people were drawn, a lot of activists joined the group because it was sexy. It was, they met people that they felt passionate about, and sometimes had romances or deep friendships, and developed a framework for queer identity that was different, that wasn't just based on nuclear family model relationships. So I think that history is really important for opening up different futures, right? And so I just want to thank the panelists again for sharing their experiences with us, and think about ways that their life experiences can help us all imagine ways in which we can make a difference, ways in which we can articulate different kinds of identities for ourselves, and more hopeful futures for our community.
Thanks so much, Tamar. Evelyn.
I just want to thank each one of you for being who you are, where you are, and how you are. Because oppression begins with not being free to express all of you in any manner, way, shape, or form. And I would challenge this audience to not just think about the passion you have, but activists must also realize what they are uncomfortable with, do not have passion about, and ask the question, why? What is it within me that is oppressive, not only to myself, but to every relationship I'm involved in? Freedom does not come just by wanting it. It comes through hard work. And none of us can do this work either for ourselves or for others alone. We need a community, or we need other people who will join us in this effort. And don't think for a minute that your actions do not make a difference. They do, one way or the other.
Thank you so much. I want to just say, as Evelyn was speaking, that really huge round of applause for Evelyn, because she has worked so hard to start the Rainbow Dialogues, to run the dialogues, yeah. Like, brings us to meetings, feeds us at those meetings. Keeps us like all going, communicates with the committee. Just, it's an honor and a privilege that I'm even holding the mic as I thank all the hard work that has made the dialogues possible. So Evelyn, whoa, thank you. Presenters, I'd like to present you with a flower. Because we love you. Milo, thank you so much. Paul, thank you so much. Stanley, thank you so much. We're so grateful. Another round of applause for our panelists. And for everyone being here today to give up your Saturday morning, which I know your time is precious. Thanks for joining us for the dialogues. Watch for us next year. It's going to be a whole day. Yeah. And I'm sure panelists would stick around if you want to ask them any additional questions. Feel free to come up.